All right, sorry about all that. I need some guys to help me hand out some things here. It's just one sheet, so yeah, it should be pretty easy. Thanks, Joe. All right, we're going to get back into Job this morning as we are introducing this. This sheet will tell you what my plan is for the study. I had this plan last week as well. This is where we are going. And we're going to, like I told you before, but I just want to know where we are going, what my plan is for the study of Job. And I'll go over this just a little bit, and then we're going to review several things from last week, and then hopefully continue to progress. I had told you before, we're trying the whole method of studying Job. I just think it's a little bit more beneficial than doing verse by verse. Now, there's going to be few places of the book of Job when we get done that we will not have covered, okay? So it's just we're going to section it off and divide it off, and I just think it'll be easier. So the first section here, as you'll notice, and really the way we're approaching this is God's transformation of Job. And I'll talk more about that today and as we progress. But it'll be several weeks, but I just want us to understand some of the background of Job, the story of Job, generally get the narrative down. I think most of us feel that we're pretty familiar with Job, but what we might find out is we're not as familiar as we think we are. And that there are some issues, I think, that are helpful to understanding Job that maybe we haven't thought about before. Okay. So we're going to do that. And then you'll notice the characters of the story. So we'll back up after we've done that. And we're going to look at, of course, God is the major character in this. I believe the book of Job is more about God than it is Job. And so we know that. But I want to look at that prologue there at the beginning. So we'll look at, remember, Satan and God have that conversation, which is very important for us. Job, I don't think, really knows about that conversation, but we do. So we're going to look at that and what's involved in that. We're going to look at his friends as we look at the characters of the story and what their background would have been, etc. We'll look at Job's wife, all right? Sometimes I think we're harder on her than maybe we should be, although she certainly was doing the work of Satan unwittingly. Then we're going to look at Job's view of his suffering and his God. And so we're going to go through a lot of Job's writings and speeches. And I will say this to you, if you haven't read in detail the kinds of things Job addresses toward God, it might be a little surprising to you. Because he's very direct in his objection to what he sees as an unfair situation. Okay. So we'll talk about all of that, and we'll take some time to work through that. We'll then look at the speeches of Job's friends as they counter him and why they're saying some of the things they're saying. A lot of times when I know at least in the past, for me at least when I was growing up, I would kind of hear about the front end of the book of Job. And then we just kind of go right over, all the speeches, and then you end up, well, Job got blessed more at the end, and God said, I'm bigger and stronger than you are. Well, that's a pretty superficial view. I'm not saying it's not part of the view, but there's more to it than that. And so we'll try to take our time. Now, I'm very excited, of course, about the divine speeches where God is describing his response to Job. And there's a lot more in there. Even though he does talk about his power and he does talk about his wisdom, I actually think there's some sections that deal with the nature of his love for his creation, which I haven't heard that spoken of a lot from. Usually it's God's power, and that certainly is there. But there's some other things, and he is helping Job. He is teaching Job. He's saying, Job, you need to reframe how you look at these things and look at them the way I look at them. And be careful about being too judgmental about that. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, of course, we'll have the actual loving correction of Job, the revelation of himself. And it is very interesting that God censors Job's friends very strongly who thought they were defending God. And he does correct Job, but he doesn't say of Job what he says of Job's friends, who again thought they were defending God. And he says, they have not spoken to me that which is right. And Job's even going to offer sacrifice for them. So we'll talk about that. But that's where we're going, so everybody should know how we're going to progress. Okay. I want to come back, and I do want to review a few things that we talked about. And like I said, the book of Job, I think, is not just about Job. Certainly Job is a character there and an important one. Let me find my little clicker. There it is. And we see his transformation in this book. But really what we learn about is what Job is learning about, and that is God. And the fact that often we want to put God in our paradigm, in our model, and say this is how God always functions. And we tend to come to really bad conclusions when we view things that way and try to limit God to our own limitations. And I think that's one of the things that Job is going to have to learn. Now, I want to go back, and we mentioned this last week, but it's not merely a matter of, as far as being a challenge to Job's faith and a challenge to our faith, it's not merely a matter of life is uncomfortable. We all know life is uncomfortable. We need to recognize that we do live in a world that's been affected by sin, and we know that, and whether we want to admit or think through it or whatever, that's the reality of where we live. It is a decaying, corrupting, sin-filled world, and as the people of God, we see that all around us. And we have to deal with the consequences that Adam and Eve brought into this world and the nature of sin. Now, we have hope of restoration, and we have hope of salvation, and we have hope of redemption, but we recognize the reality, and Job was going to have to come to recognize that as well. But it wasn't simply a matter of it's uncomfortable or it's difficult or it's taxing. Job feels like, and we're going to talk about why, but Job feels like this is an unfair situation. And before you decide to throw Job under the bus on that, and this may shock you that I'm saying it is an unfair situation if we're looking at it purely from retribution standpoints, and we're going to talk more about this. If that's the paradigm, if it's a very equivalent 2 + 2 = 4, now somebody says, well, yeah, but Bruce, Job was a sinner like anybody else was a sinner. That's true, we're all sinners, but I don't know that that's the main thrust of the book of Job. The book of Job is a narrative we know from the very beginning about a man that God considered to be faithful, about a man that was upright. So spending all our time you telling me or me telling you, well, Job was a sinner, that's not the point. Yes, and Job had to learn some things about God. Job was an upright, faithful man, even by God's estimation. That doesn't mean Job was sinless, but it does mean he was right with God. It does mean that even the Lord had respect for Job. And we see that when you look at Job chapter 1 and verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. I mean, that's the whole point to the background. If Job is not a faithful man, or if somehow what God does to Job, or allows, I should say, to be done to Job, is some kind of retribution for sin, then the whole book falls apart as far as the message. Sometimes people sound more like Job's friends than they do the message of Job. Okay? So, Job is a faithful man. He is a man that's conscientious and cares about the Lord. Now, let's talk about Satan's perspective. And I wanted to get to that last week. But let's talk about what is Satan's argument. And it's pretty clear here in Job chapter 1. Let's read Job chapter 1 in verses 6 through 12. Job chapter 1 verses 6 through 12. Bo, can you get that for me, please?
Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "I'm going to and fro on the earth, and walking back and forth on it." And the Lord said he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
So the God says, I'm going to allow you to do this, Satan. But what was his initial invitation on the front end? He says, what? Yeah, he couldn't touch Job initially. Okay. But let's talk about what Satan's argument is. There are arguments going on in this narrative. Okay. So Satan's argument was what? Okay, so basically, Satan's argument is, okay, you are blessing Job, and you might even see Job as a representative of the faithful of God. Is it true that God offers blessings of various kinds to his faithful people? Yeah, it is. Okay, so he says, well, what are we after here? We're after genuine love. Does Job really love you? Would he serve you no matter what? And Satan's argument is, you have put a hedge of protection around him. God had. You've blessed him. You know, he has all these blessings. He has this land. He has family. Everything's going pretty good. And Satan's argument is, that's why he's serving you. If you take that stuff away from him, then he's going to do what? He'll curse you to your face. So his argument is that there's no way for us really to know if Job would truly serve you because you've blessed him. Right? So somehow blessings undermine finding out what we're talking about. Okay, if Satan is making an argument, that is his argument. That's what I was trying to say last week. But that's his argument. Okay, Alan, did you have your hand up a minute ago? Did anybody else? Okay, so when we think about Satan's argument, it's pretty clear. You know, he says, well, does Job fear God for nothing? And I mentioned this, but it is interesting because a lot of what Satan attributes to Job, which actually is not the case at all, we find out, is how Satan thinks. It is how Satan feels. And so, you know, sometimes people tend to do that. They attribute their wrong thinking to everybody else around them. And so if they lie, you're a liar. If they cheat and steal, then you cheat and steal. That's just how they think. And so Satan's saying, no, he's not doing this just because he loves you. And when you think of Satan as the accuser, he accuses God to man and man to God. And this is a perfect example of what we see him trying to do. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about that? Is that pretty clear? Everybody with me on this? Okay. All right, so that's Satan's argument. Let's talk about Job and his friends and their view of things. So Job's friends, what is their basic, there's some different nuances, but for the most part, what is going to be their, and we'll talk more about this later, but their argument as they look at the situation, and of course they come to be with Job, and they were better friends when they kept their mouth shut, because they came for a good while to be with Job, to show, the Bible says, to show compassion to Job, and they see him, and there are recognizable issues going on here. And so now they try to process this with their theology about God. And what is there, if you were going to boil their argument down and you didn't read the slide behind me, what would they say? Yeah, he must have sinned. We'll talk about why sometimes we throw them under the bus and then we talk like them. Okay, but there's a reason. We're going to talk about it in a moment. The reason they think this way, okay, it's taking a mode of operation, if you will, or a paradigm in which God often does operate, and saying it's always that way. It's not that there are. Is there ever a time when somebody was punished, even physically, by God because of the fact that they had sinned? Sure. It's just this situation doesn't fit that model. Okay, Alan, go ahead.
Is it also that they took a paradigm that applies to groups and trying to narrow it down to an individual like Israel? If they obeyed God, they would be blessed, but people still are going to get sick, they're going to die individually, they're going to suffer in different ways.
Right.
But they tried to take the general and apply it to the specific.
That's a good. Well, and I think that's a fair point. Satan even does that in his temptation of Jesus. If you go back, he'll take generic kind of statements that are generally true, and he'll try to apply it to a situation to which it does not apply. Okay, so at the very outset, what we're going to find out from the book of Job is that God's interaction with man doesn't need to be oversimplified. Okay, when we take generalities and we apply it to every single situation that shouldn't apply to those situations, then sometimes we end up with bad conclusions. Go ahead, Barry.
Well, we see this attitude in John 9, where the man is born blind, and the disciples ask Jesus, who sinned, him or his parents, that he would be born blind?
That's right.
And so this must have been retribution for some sin.
Right, and that's a perfect segue. Thank you. But we talked a little bit about that. Let me tell you something. Understanding this for me in my study of Job, me personally, has been very helpful. Okay, so before we say, well, why aren't we spending time? Hang on, we'll get there. But to Barry's point, this was a fairly, I think, common idea. We even see it in the New Testament with the disciples of Jesus. And sometimes we catch ourselves, even when we're dealing with suffering, we're naturally, it feels like, going to be tempted to say, that person didn't deserve that. Well, based on, pure retribution principles, we're probably right, but we can't hold God to this one very overly simplified model in all things. And we need to be careful when we make statements to people who are grieving if that's what we're trying to do. Okay. All right. So in John 9 is certainly a good example. So we have his friends who was like, look, Job, either you were about to sin or you have sinned, or this is some kind of punishment. We're going to talk about why. So I'm asking you to think about, why do they do so? Why do they make this argument? Now, I think probably Job thought that before this situation. And it's going to present some problems for him too in trying to process what's going on. And that's part of his transformation. So based on the paradigm Job understands God to be operating out of, he believes God to have targeted him. Look at Job 7. And let's look at Job 7 in verses 20 and 21. Job chapter 7. And we'll look at this section later on in our study, but I want you to just notice it. Let's read Job 7, 20 and 21. Garrett, can you get that for me?
Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of me? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie in the dust, and you will seek me, but I will not be found.
Okay, so he certainly, notice that language in verse 20, why have you set me as your target? That's how he felt. And can't you understand that? I mean, if Job in the integrity and faithfulness of his heart is examining his life, and even God has said he was an upright man. You have to remember, Job doesn't know about that conversation between the Lord and Satan. He doesn't know that actually God is holding him up as this kind of ideal to say, okay, yeah, but what about Job? He doesn't know any of that. All he knows is what he's going through, and if he is trying to process this the same way his friends have, through what we're calling retribution theology. Let me just give you a basic definition, and I'm going to use that phrase throughout this study, but you're going to know what I'm talking about. Retribution theology is somebody gets what they deserve. The faithful are blessed, the unfaithful are not. Okay. And there are sections, and this is why we looked at Psalms 1 versus Psalm 73. I'm not going to do that again, but Psalms 1, remember that and ultimately that's true. Ultimately the faithful are blessed. And ultimately the wicked are like the chaff which the wind drives away. That's all true ultimately. But in our human experience, when you get down with a microscope and you look at various situations, it doesn't always work out that way. Okay, so you can read Psalms 1, but then you come to Psalm 73, and Asaph is looking around, and he said, what in the world's going on? Have I cleansed my hands in my innocence for nothing? Now eventually he says, he saw the wicked seem to be prospering, and the faithful are having a tough time. Everything seems inverted. Everything seems upside down or inside out or whatever. And later on he says, but when I went into the sanctuary of God, verse 17 of Psalm 73, then I understood their end. So when you look at it in the with a big scope, you can say, okay, God's going to bring judgment. He's going to do all that. But we have to face the fact as those who live in a world that has sickness and pain and difficulty, that if we are expecting a strict retribution principle in every situation in the immediate real time, that is not what God has promised us. Okay? Now, when people have an overly simplified view of things, they tend to lose their faith. So when we don't talk about these kind of complexities, it's not a good thing, okay? Because I don't think that leaves us where we need to go. Okay, so why would Job have felt that way before? Why do his friends feel that way, etc.? All right, so basically Satan is saying, well, if you bless the faithful, how do you know if they really love you? And I don't think they do. And Job is saying, well, what sense does it make for the faithful to have to go through all of these difficulties? It doesn't seem to fit the paradigm. I mean, it doesn't seem to fit retribution theology and that kind of thing. Okay. Everybody with me? Okay. If you're not, just say, yes, Bruce, we're with you. Okay, good. Retribution theology is one of the paradigms through which God operates, but it is not the only paradigm in which He expresses His will. As the biblical writers often recognize, the operation of this law of just recompense or retribution is not always evident in our human experience. And that's what we're talking about. Now, let me go further. We talked about Psalms 1, Psalm 73. Job 21:7. Job protests, I think, based on that thinking. If you can imagine, I probably should have put a triangle up here. If you can imagine a triangle, and you got three issues at stake. There's this retribution theology idea, okay? Everybody gets what they deserve. And then there is God's holiness and faithfulness or justice or whatever. And then there's Job's righteousness. So the friends come in this thing and they look at it and they say, well, God's holiness can't be compromised, right? And we know retribution theology is always right. So whose fault is this? Well, it has to be Job's. Wrong argument. So if Job looks at this and goes, in the integrity of my heart, this isn't me. I've not been in some awful rebellion against God. Okay, if retribution theology is the way it is, then He's targeted me for some reason. That kind of discombobulates Him a little bit. Okay. The truth is, this retribution theology idea doesn't always match up with the situation, and that would have resolved a lot of this, which is what I think the book of Job is doing for us. So notice Job 21:7. Why do the wicked live on and reach old age and grow mighty in power? Job says in Job 21:17 and 31, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? How often does calamity come upon them? How often does God distribute pains in His anger? And who repays them for what they have done? That sounds like retribution. So this thing is backwards. And you can understand why that would be difficult for him. So what I'm suggesting is that Job and his friends were short-sighted, more his friends than Job. Yeah, go.
Part of the issue, too, is we tend to bring the eternal scheme of redemption.
Yes.
Punishment and reward, wickedness and righteousness, and try to fit it into take the spiritual scheme of redemption, fit it into our physical existence here.
Yeah, and there are a couple of things to mention. There are some axiomatic principles. You have like Galatians 6 that says if you sow to the flesh, you have the flesh reap corruption. You sow to the Spirit, you have the Spirit reap life everlasting. And sometimes you see examples of that where somebody has just lived a life of debauchery and there's certain consequences that come home to them. Okay? And it is generally true, and Proverbs does a lot for us in this, it's generally true there's certain principles of wisdom that tend in the generality to bring a more blessed life. Those are true statements, we see that. But it doesn't always work that way. And then when you take the general truth of God's holiness and justice in the end, and you try to apply it to every single situation, Job's particularly, it's not going to work. But I think if we understand where his friends, why they're thinking the way they're thinking, it helps us appreciate how valuable and significant the book of Job is. Okay, let me show you that. One thing about wisdom literature is not only do you have a dialogue going on within it, I really believe there are some situations where, especially as you think about Job versus Proverbs, okay, they talk to each other in a way. It's almost like a conversation with one another. I don't know if you've thought about that, so stay with me on this. Proverbs is written and it deals with general principles of wisdom, okay? But again, you don't need to take those general truths and try to be too specific with them and take them out of their given context. And there's times even in Proverbs where it'll flip the thing that's said. You might, if you read through Proverbs. But I want to show you something. So in Proverbs 13 and verse 21, the proverb there says, misfortune pursues sinners, but prosperity rewards the righteous. What does that sound like? Retribution. Yeah, sure. And is that generally true? Yeah. And could we all think, and could Job have thought, and we all could appeal to these situations where somebody is sinful and we see misfortune come upon them, or someone is righteous and there's blessings associated with that, especially when you go back to the Old Testament. Yeah, okay, but the book of Job, I think, offers a reality check on that and trying to take a general truth and apply it too specifically, because here we've got a faithful man who suffers a whole lot. Okay? So this is one of the beautiful things about biblical literature, and one of the reasons I love wisdom literature so much, is not only do you have the discussion in the book, you get this, it's almost like balancing scales. Yeah, that statement about Proverbs is true, but don't forget about Job. Okay. Now, when you kind of understand how they thought about retribution theology, can't you really see how Job, and even the way we think sometimes, how Job is very significant in helping us to process some things. Okay. I don't think the book of Job gives us all the answers. I don't think Job got all the answers. But it does indicate to us you can't be too hard and fast with saying everybody that suffers or has a child that's sick or something like that, well, that's attributed to some sin they committed. Okay. Barry.
The Pharisees took Proverbs 13:21 to heart. They made it a hard and fast rule. Mm-hmm. They said that if you have misfortune, it's because you are a sinner or someone close to you sinned. And they also said if a person is rich,
that's right,
God loves them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're fine in God's eyes.
Well, okay, let's go with that for a minute. Take Jesus to Barry's point. Jesus inverts that retribution principle all day long. Okay? I mean, think about the story of the rich man and Lazarus. We often say, here's a great text to tell us about what happens after we die. Well, okay, but sometimes in the process of talking about that, we miss the point. If you look at that text throughout, especially Luke is all about the inclusiveness of the gospel. Outsiders becoming insiders, and some who thought they were insiders going out. Okay. You have the rich man and Lazarus. What was the Jewish thought of retribution? Well, it had to be that the rich man had been blessed by God, and the poor man must have sinned. And yet Jesus' story is the very opposite of that. The poor man was the man of faith, and he goes to paradise. And the rich man, who they were assuming had been blessed by God, wasn't right with God at all. And so what is Jesus doing? He's exposing the very thing Barry's talking about. He's exposing the problem in their thinking. And by the way, that served as a defense mechanism for them. We must be right with God. Who cares what Jesus says? And was Jesus wealthy when God became flesh? No, that's not how he came. So, and some commentators, and I like this phrase, will call this divine reversals. So, in the Scripture, you see it a lot. Rahab, outsider, comes in. Let's see, Achan, insider, cast out because of his sin. So, Jesus himself, the incarnation, was like a big divine reversal of saying, you guys don't really understand truth and righteousness. And I think Job is going to expose that tendency for us as well. Okay? Anybody have a comment or question? Okay. All right. Oh. Now, when you think about the emphasis, and later on I'll probably mention some things about the timing of the book and all that, even though I don't think that's, I think there are some conclusions we might come to, but I don't want to get bogged down in that. The emphasis of the book. This is a great lesson for us. The book of Job does not focus on explaining why Job suffered. Now, we have some indications of some background to it, but we don't know all the minute details. That's not really the point. But it is about the things that Job had to come to grapple with regarding God when he suffered. Okay. So I think that's very important for us, to not forget the greatness and the transcendence and the love and the beauty of God even when things are very difficult for us. And toward the end of the book, God focuses on His wisdom and His power, and I think even His love. Now, were Job's motives pure? They were. What we find out is he serves God because of who God is, not because of what God gives. Now, people say, yeah, but he's really blessed at the end. But even if Job had not been blessed at the end, I don't think the story changes a whole lot as far as his faithfulness to God. He was going to be faithful to the Lord in that way. Now, what did happen is his understanding, and this is where his transformation comes in, his understanding of God's wisdom and power and love and the model through which God may operate needs to be redefined, and he doesn't need to be so mechanical about his view of the Lord. All right, let's talk a little bit about the kind of the genre, the structure of Job, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We're going to roll on through this. But it is a very unique book because it's poetry, and remember that it's poetry. It's not exactly a historical narrative, not that there's not a historical narrative it's rooted in, but it is poetry, but within the poetry you have this debate and dialogue that's going on that's quite revealing. Robert Alter said, "Its astounding poetry eclipses all other biblical poetry working in the same formal system, but in a style that is often distinct both lexically and imaginatively from its biblical counterparts," which is fancy language to say this is a great book. Job is not merely a book of history, it is literary artistry. Okay, so let's look at the structure. We have that prologue, which is in the narrative form. By the way, you guys, I'll give you all of these slides, and even if you want my notes, which are pretty extensive for me, I'll be happy to copy that off for you if you're interested in that. The prologue is in narrative form. You have Job 1 and 2. That kind of gives you a historical introduction. Then in chapter 3, when we get to chapter 3, you're going to see Job's opening lament. Now remember in chapter 1, you had that initial limitation, don't touch Job. But what's going to happen next?
Because you just can't kill him.
Yeah, you can't take his life, but he's going to be like a walking dead man when Satan gets done. And he's still not going to compromise. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have some pretty forthright things, charges, but then that changes as he actually comes into the presence of God. So there's some dialogues. First cycle of speeches, Job 4 through 14. Second cycle of speeches, Job 15 through 21. Third cycle of speeches, Job 22 through 27. There's a wisdom hymn in chapter 28. There will be some discourses, Job 29 through 31. And in those, Job's going to acknowledge the greatness of God, but he's still going to defend his own righteousness. And see, that just threw his friends for a loop. Elihu in 32 through 37 is a young man who's convinced that he has some fresh perspectives. There's some debate about that. God's divine speeches are going to be in chapters 38 through 41. And this is interesting. I'll talk more about this. How does God, when we have these speeches by him in 38 through 41, what's his form of dialogue with, I mean, does he just say, look, Job, this is the way it is. Boom, 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 boom. These kind of propositional statements. No, not exactly. How does he teach? This is a great lesson. God is the perfect teacher. He could have done that. He asked questions. They're rhetorical questions. But if you'll think about it, even if you're asking a rhetorical question softens the blow more than just a propositional statement. Okay? So even as he's got like 77 questions where the answer is obvious, but it's still, you see him, he's not wanting to destroy Job. He's wanting to teach him and teach him about who he is, and the things that will sustain him will be his understanding of the greatness of God in comparison to himself. Okay. So that is interesting. When we get to chapter 42, verses 1 through 6, Job's been saying, I want to come into his presence. He even wants a representative. He wants to talk to God, and then he gets in the presence of God. And that is a very humbling, corrective experience, and he comes to a new perspective. But he is surrendering to God, and he is submitting to who he is. And one of the things we learn, I don't get the sense that God is repulsed by Job asking or saying or wondering. Sometimes we have the idea if we ever have any questions regarding God, that somehow that's a deficient faith. No, that's a healthy faith. If we're seeking to believe in God, I don't think the relationship is so fragile that he doesn't want those questions. I think he does, but he wants us to listen to his answers in his revelation and to trust him. All right, now I'm just going to flash some stuff up here on this. I've got 2 sections. Next Sunday is going to be what I want us to do. I want you to have on the front end the fact that there are some really practical things I want you to be thinking about as we go through Job. A lot of times we go all the way through the book and we say, okay, here's what we should have learned from all that. Well, before we go through the book, I just want to throw some stuff at you that I think is going to be worthwhile. We won't have time to get into some of the stuff, but I do want to throw this up here. One of the things we're going to learn as far as issues in Job is that suffering reveals the nature of faith. That's something we see all the way through the Scripture. Suffering reveals the nature of faith in a very unique way. Sometimes we feel like we're stronger than we are until we really suffer pain that we haven't suffered before. And we're going to go back over these things. Number 2, God has divine purposes in his allowance of suffering that we may not be aware of in our human understanding. So, yes, there are some logical things to talk about, some questions. There needs to be some defense of God in some situations. But recognize, we're the little dot, he's God. And he has a different perspective of things in view of eternity, and we see that. Okay? This issue of retribution theology that we've talked about is exposed as not being the end-all explanation of things. Okay? So we don't necessarily assume some sin caused suffering. Now, there is a sense in which we look at suffering generally in the world today that the sin's entrance into the world contributed to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean everybody that suffers has committed some rebellious act before God. And we're going to have some questions. Is God powerful? Does God care? Does the Lord love us? Those are all basic questions that are going to pop into your mind when you suffer. And then hopefully your faith is going to help you cope with that and deal with that. But the book of Job is going to help us in that way. I'm going to just throw these. We're going to go back over these things, but I got just a couple minutes. I want to get these in front of you. Some lessons we should focus on. We need to realize that life can be unpredictable, but God is faithful. We tend to think God is faithful only when we can predict what's going to happen. The day Job got up and all this happened, he didn't know about the conversation. He didn't know all this was going to happen. God's not obligated to send us a note and say, by the way, this real tragic thing is going to happen to you. No, just because things aren't predictable to us doesn't mean God is not faithful. Okay, we get surprised. We go, whoa, what's going on? Well, Job shows us that very thing. Strong vertical views prevent a panicked horizontal perspective. We're going to look at least early on in chapter 1 where we see that from him. We get caught up in this, but the more we think about eternity, the more settling it can be even when we are feeling like we're in an emotional panic. Okay. Advice from those who love us may stink. Okay? People who want you to get over things, people who are trying to help you deal with grief, people who are trying to deal with pain, they can come to you and say, well, they may not have been through what you've been through, but they have all the answers, and they're going to tell you what you ought to do about it and how long you ought to grieve. They've got the calendar out, and they've marked the day that you're supposed to be done. That's not good to do. And one of the things we know is he got some advice from people who I think really love Job. but it wasn't sound. It wasn't even really true. Okay? All right, we'll talk about that. Sound teaching and biblical theology keeps faith stable. This is what keeps me stable. When everything feels like it's falling apart, this is what keeps you stable. So don't stop reading and studying and praying. Okay. And we see that in 2:10. And the importance of being the right kind of friend. We can learn what not to do and what to do. As I mentioned to you, as friends, before they said anything, were really good friends. But then when they started trying to put God in their little box, not only is that not honoring to God, but it ends up doing damage that's hard to undo. Okay? All right. We'll stop there. That's where I'm going, by the way. Okay.